So we've talked earlier about the United States in the 1950s being a culture of conformity, where it was far safer to not stick out, to not be different, to not express dissent for fear of being swept up in anti-communism and the Red Scare. However, the 1950s does have dissent if you know where to look. Certainly, there was a lot of dissent and critique of American culture in the 1950s in academia. Sociologists like C. Wright Mills argued in the 1950s that American politics had become dominated by a power elite of businessmen, politicians, and military leaders. And that meant that freedom and participation in government had essentially been stripped from average American citizens, so that we no longer had an equal voice in our government because it was dominated by an elite. We also had psychologists weighing in on how 1950s America created a culture ripe with anxiety. David Reisman, in his book The Lonely Crowd in 1950, argued that this mass society of consumption and of conformity left Americans lonely and anxious. And while they had adopted a strategy of conformity to try to ensure some sense of stability and normalcy, that it actually furthered a lack of independent thought and actions. So that Americans were just kind of following the norm without questioning rather than engaging in critical thinking and analysis and independent thought. Multiple scholarly works throughout the 1950s identified modern work culture in corporations, suburban life, traditional gender roles, and other elements of American society as deeply problematic and unfulfilling. But a lot of Americans don't tend to listen to scholars at universities. And in fact, we've seen, even with like textbooks and education, usually there's at least a 10 to 20-year gap between what scholars in higher education are doing and when that actually translates into the mainstream. Criticizing American conformity became something of a cottage industry in academia, but few mainstream Americans are taking notice. And instead, if you're looking for more widespread dissent in the 1950s, you need to look at youth culture. The baby boom generation, the earliest of them, born in 1945, become teenagers by the late 1950s. And the first wave of baby boom teenagers in the late 50s start to expose a generation gap, a profound difference in culture between these baby boomers and their older parents, and an increasing sense of alienation. These young boomers were challenging this notion of conformity, of needing to achieve the American dream of a house in the suburbs with a car and a corporate job, right? Stay at home mom. Increasingly, these teenagers were not buying into that concept. We can see evidence of dissent in youth culture in books like J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, published in 1951, in Hollywood films like Rebel Without a Cause and The Blackboard Jungle, both released in 1955, and in rock and roll music. Some of the earliest rock and roll music comes out of the late 1940s. In fact, what's dubbed the earliest rock and roll song is a song called Rocket 88. If you go onto YouTube and you listen to a clip of that song, wait until you get all the way to the end, and you'll hear a distorted guitar. That is the first time we hear a distorted guitar, which will become a hallmark of rock and roll on the recording, and this is from the late 1940s. Rock and roll music originates among African Americans. Rock and roll was originally 1950s slang for sex. Okay, so how 1950s rock and roll African American songs start to jump over into the mainstream is not only by the increasing popularity of African American artists like Chuck Berry and Little Richard, but by white artists like Elvis Presley. So Elvis Presley takes rock and roll music and makes it more mainstream and appealing to a white teenage audience. And Elvis Presley, while we today would view his singing and his dancing as relatively tame, in an age where we see twerking, right? Elvis Presley's dance moves for the time were considered highly provocative. In fact, during TV appearances, very frequently he was filmed only from the waist up so that the cameras were not capturing his gyrating hips for fear of being too scandalous. And American teenagers loved this music. They saw this music as the height of rebellion, that they're listening to a genre named after sex, that they're listening to African American artists and musicians, that they're, listening and watching these performances that are more provocative, and their parents hate it. Their parents hate it so much, which makes the teenagers love it even more. Okay. Usually, this is a symbol of the generation gap, right? The music that you find cool, your parents hate. Okay. So, this is definitely true in the 1950s. Another place to look at dissent in the 1950s is among college students. So, college students in the 1950s aren't boomers, they're a little bit too old to be boomers. But we do start to see a movement called the Beats emerge in cities and college towns, where small groups of young people, often college students, start to critique mainstream culture through the mediums of poetry and literature. Beat poets rejected middle class values, they rejected materialism and militarism, and throughout beat culture, you see them advocating for a spontaneous lifestyle devoted to peace and pleasure, particularly achieving pleasure through sexual experimentation and drug experimentation. One of the classic novels of this time period is Jack Kerouac's On the Road, published in 1957. But really, the height of beat culture, if you really kind of want to see the essence of the beat movement, is Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl, published in 1955, which criticizes conformity and materialism. The beat movement, though, is always much smaller than the white teenage fascination with rock and roll. And dissent in the 1950s among white people would largely remain cultural through the exploration of music and film. Or it would remain among the elite. So think about academics and the college students that are part of the beat movement. Really, widespread political dissent among white audiences doesn't really start to emerge until the 1960s. But the other area that we look at and find dissent in the 1950s is in the civil rights movement. More on that next time. Until next time, I'm Dr. Esmacher.